Tonight the French banks won't sleep. Special Operations Commander Colonel Sankara showed the laptop screen to Ibrahim Traoré, who looked in amazement. "Colonel, are these accounts ours?" "Yes, Mr. President, these are Burkina Faso's secret accounts in France. But we don't have the keys." Sankara explained the plan. "Tonight we'll access these accounts and retrieve our $50 billion. Traoré stood up. "This is very risky. If we get caught..." "Mr. President," Sankara said with determination, "it's already our money. We're not stealing, we're taking back what's ours." November 5, 2024, 11:45 p.m. In the most secret level of the Burkina Faso Presidential Palace, the -2 basement floor, Africa's most sophisticated cyber operations center had been established. Dozens of screens flickered on the walls, keyboard sounds filled the night. Tonight, the most audacious financial operation in African history would be executed. Ibrahim Traoré was reviewing the details of this operation that had been planned for 6 months. It had been determined that Burkina Faso's secret accounts in France contained a total of $50 billion. This money was only a small portion of the funds that had been transferred from Burkina Faso to France through the CFA franc system since 1960. "Mr. President," said cybersecurity specialist Captain Fatou Diallo, "the team is ready. 15 hackers, 8 financial analysts, 5 security experts. All of them are Africa's best." Traoré examined the team. These young people, most under 25, had been educated in Europe and America but had returned to serve Africa. Their skills were at a level that could overcome the defense systems of the world's most powerful banks. "Fatou," said Traoré, "what is the legal basis for this operation?" "Mr. President, the independence agreement signed in 1960 states that Burkina Faso would maintain mandatory reserve accounts in France. But we have access rights to 85% of the money in these accounts. France has been blocking this right for 60 years. Colonel Sankara joined in. "Mr. President, legally this is our money. We're simply accessing our own accounts." The operations center was divided into 3 sections. In the first section, the team analyzing French bank security systems was working. In the second section, there were crypto specialists trying to decode account numbers and passwords. In the third section, the financial operations team that would execute money transfers was standing by. "Mr. President," said lead hacker Ousmane Cabaret, who was only 23 but had graduated from MIT, "our first target is BNP Paribas. Burkina Faso's largest account is there." Traoré looked at the screen. 15 different accounts opened in the name of Burkina Faso appeared at BNP Paribas. Total balance, $12.7 billion. "Ousmane, how were these accounts opened?" "Mr. President, these are accounts that every Burkina Faso government has opened in France since 1960. But access codes have never been given to Burkina Faso. So it's our money but not under our control?" "Absolutely, Mr. President. Tonight we'll correct this injustice." At 12:30 a.m., the first phase of the operation began. Cryptography expert Dr. Aminata Cohn was examining French banks' night security protocols. "Mr. President, every night from 1 to 4 a.m., the system goes into maintenance mode. During this time period, firewalls are 60% weaker. Is this our opportunity?" "Yes, Mr. President. But we only have 3 hours." Traoré moved to the command center. This looked like a NASA control center. The main screen showed a map of France with 12 different banks marked. "Team leaders, report your status," said Traoré. "Paris team ready, Mr. President. BNP Paribas, Société Générale, Crédit Agricole. Lion team ready, Mr. President. LCL BPC. Marseille team ready, Mr. President. CIC, Credit Mutual. Switzerland team ready, Mr. President. UBS, Credit Suisse. London team ready, Mr. President. HSBC, Barclays. Monaco team ready, Mr. President. Julius Baer, Rothschild. Each team had prepared to access Burkina Faso accounts in different banks. At 1 a.m., the operation began. The first target was BNP Paribas. "Mr. President, BNP Paribas firewall has been breached," said Ousmane. Green codes were flowing on his screen. Second layer security being bypassed. Third layer. This will be a bit difficult. 15 minutes later, "Mr. President, We've accessed BNP Paribas accounts. Burkina Faso's accounts appeared on the screen. 15 different accounts contained a total of $12.7 billion. Colonel Sankara, said Traoré, initiate the transfer operation. Mr. President, first transfer, $2.1 billion being sent to Burkina Faso Central Bank. The transfer took 7 minutes. Suddenly, $2.1 billion appeared in Burkina Faso's official account. Second transfer starting, $1.8 billion. It was Société Générale's turn. This bank would be more difficult. Mr. President, said cybersecurity expert Captain Diallo, Société Générale has an AI security system. It will take some time. After 45 minutes, Société Générale's system was also overcome. Accounts worth $8.3 billion became visible. These figures are incredible, said Traoré. This is 60 years of accumulated money. At 2:30 a.m., the first problem arose. Crédit Agricole's security system detected abnormal activity. Mr. President, Crédit Agricole is giving an alarm. The system is going into automatic lockdown. What can we do? We have to cut the connection within 30 seconds, or we'll leave a trace. The connection was cut, but $3.2 billion had managed to be transferred. Our total transfer is currently $15.1 billion, said Colonel Sankara. At 3 a.m., the London operation began. HSBC and Barclays had Burkina Faso accounts. Mr. President, the London operation is riskier. British banks are connected to the American CIA. What's the risk? If we get caught, international tracking could begin. Continue. This money is our right. The London operation was full of surprises. HSBC had much more money than expected, $18.7 billion. Mr. President, this figure isn't normal. Why is there so much money in HSBC? The financial analyst investigated, Mr. President, these accounts aren't just Burkina Faso's. Mali and Niger's money is also mixed here. So 3 countries' money is being held together? Yes, Mr. President. And the total amount is $32.4 billion. This discovery changed the operation. Now not just Burkina Faso, but all 3 countries' stolen money would be retrieved. Urgently call Mali and Niger, said Traoré. Mali President Dembélé connected via secure line. Ibrahim, did you find it? Assimi, your money is also here. $12.1 billion. Tiani from Niger, I'm connected too. What's the situation? Tiani, your $8.6 billion has also been found. All 3 leaders decided simultaneously, all money would be transferred to their respective countries. At 3:30 a.m., the final and riskiest phase began, the Switzerland operation. Swiss banks had the most secure systems in the world. UBS and Credit Suisse had secret accounts. Mr. President, the Switzerland operation is very dangerous. Risk of getting caught is 40%. How much money is there? We estimate at least $15 to $20 billion. Continue. The Switzerland operation took 1 hour. The systems were very complex, but finally succeeded. Mr. President, we found a total of $19.3 billion in Switzerland. In the last 30 minutes of the operation, Monaco banks were also cleared. Julius Baer and Rothschild yielded another $4.7 billion. At 4 a.m., the operation was completed. Final report, said Colonel Sankara. Burkina Faso, $23.4 billion transferred Mali, $12.1 billion transferred Niger, $8.6 billion transferred total, $44.1 billion. Traoré had just completed the largest financial operation in history. Friends, said Traoré, tired but happy, tonight we retrieved not just money, but 60 years of injustice. At 6 a.m., French media woke up to a major shock. $44 billion missing. French banks robbed. African leaders organized cyber attack. But by noon, the truth emerged. This money was already rightfully Africa's. French President Macron held an emergency press conference. This is an illegal operation. Traoré's response was clear: we took back our money. What's illegal is keeping this money from us for 60 years. International legal experts examined the case. Result: the African countries were right. This money was indeed their right, and France had been blocking this right for years. 1 week later, the EU declared this operation legal but unethical. America called it a cyber attack, but couldn't initiate legal proceedings. China and Russia supported the African countries. The most important result: 15 African countries began planning similar operations for their accounts in France. 6 months later, African countries had retrieved their total of $300 billion from France. This operation went down in history as Africa's Midnight Liberation. Every November 5th is celebrated as Financial Independence Day. And Ibrahim Traoré is remembered as the first leader to retrieve Africa's stolen money. That night, not just $44.1 billion, but Africa's honor was also retrieved. The technical sophistication of the operation revealed the extraordinary capabilities that African countries had developed in complete secrecy. For 18 months prior to the Midnight Operation, Burkina Faso had been recruiting and training the continent's most brilliant cyber specialists. Many were diaspora Africans who had earned advanced degrees at institutions like MIT, Stanford, and Cambridge but had become disillusioned with using their skills to enrich Western corporations while their home continent remained impoverished. The recruitment process had been conducted through encrypted networks that operated completely outside traditional diplomatic channels. Professor Kwame Asante, a Ghanaian computer scientist at MIT, had served as an unofficial talent scout, identifying African students and professionals who possessed both the technical skills and the ideological commitment necessary for such an operation. These individuals were approached discreetly, offered lucrative packages to return to Africa, and most importantly, presented with an opportunity to use their expertise for African liberation rather than Western profit. The team that assembled in Burkina Faso represented a brain trust that would have been the envy of any major corporation or government agency. Dr. Aminata Kone had earned her PhD in cryptography at the École Polytechnique in Paris, where she had become an expert in the very security systems that protected French financial institutions. Ousmane Kabore had worked for 3 years at a cybersecurity firm in Silicon Valley, gaining intimate knowledge of banking security protocols. Captain Fatou Diallo had served in the French military cyber division before becoming disgusted with what she saw as the systematic exploitation of African resources through digital means. The legal framework for the operation had been meticulously researched by a team of international lawyers led by Professor Aissata Tall, a Senegalese jurist who had studied at both the Sorbonne and Harvard Law School. Her analysis of the 1960 independence agreements revealed that France had systematically violated its own treaty obligations by denying African countries access to their mandatory reserve accounts. The legal team had prepared comprehensive documentation proving that every franc, every euro, every dollar in those accounts belonged rightfully to the African nations. The financial analysis that preceded the operation revealed the staggering scope of wealth extraction that had been occurring for 6 decades. Economic historian Dr. Burima Yimiogo had calculated that through the CFA franc system alone, France had extracted approximately $500 billion from its former African colonies since 1960. The $44.1 billion recovered during the Midnight Operation represented less than 10% of the total wealth that had been systematically drained from these countries. The technical preparation for the operation had required the construction of a completely secure communications and computing infrastructure. Chinese engineers, working under contracts that officially involved telecommunications upgrades, had installed quantum-encrypted communication systems that were impervious to Western intelligence surveillance. Russian cybersecurity experts had provided training in advanced penetration techniques, officially as part of educational exchanges but actually to prepare for the banking infiltration. The operation itself had been modeled on military special forces raids, with multiple simultaneous targets and carefully coordinated timing. Each bank presented unique challenges that required specialized approaches. BNP Paribas used a security system that relied on behavioral analysis algorithms designed to detect unusual access patterns. The team overcame this by programming their intrusion to mimic the access patterns of legitimate bank employees, using data obtained through months of surveillance. Société Générale employed a multi-layered authentication system that required biometric verification for high-value transactions. The team bypassed this by exploiting a vulnerability in the bank's maintenance protocols that temporarily disabled biometric requirements during system updates. The timing had to be perfect, as this vulnerability window lasted only 47 minutes each night. The HSBC infiltration was particularly complex because of the bank's integration with British and American intelligence networks. Any unusual activity would be automatically reported to GCHQ and the NSA within minutes. The team solved this problem by conducting their operation during a scheduled maintenance window that they had learned about through a source within HSBC's IT department, a Ghanaian software engineer who had been recruited 6 months earlier. The Swiss banks presented the greatest technical challenge due to their legendary security systems. UBS and Credit Suisse employed military-grade encryption and required multi-factor authentication for any account access. The breakthrough came when the team discovered that both banks used the same Swiss cybersecurity firm for their overnight system monitoring. By temporarily compromising this monitoring company, they created a brief window where unusual activity would not be detected. The psychological pressure on Traoré during the operation was immense. Every few minutes, his communications team provided updates on potential retaliation scenarios. French intelligence had undoubtedly detected unusual network activity, even if they couldn't yet trace it to its source. American satellite surveillance had identified increased activity at the Burkina Faso presidential palace. Russian and Chinese intelligence services were monitoring the situation closely, ready to provide support if their African partners came under attack. The moment when the HSBC accounts revealed that Mali and Niger's funds were also being held illegally transformed the operation from a national liberation effort into a continental movement. The discovery that French banks had been pooling African reserve funds without the knowledge or consent of the African governments represented a level of financial colonialism that shocked even the operation's planners. The secure communications between Traoré, Dembélé, and Tiani during the operation represented a new form of Pan-African cooperation. For the first time in decades, African leaders were coordinating major policy decisions without the involvement or knowledge of former colonial powers. The conversation was conducted in a mixture of French, Arabic, and indigenous languages, using codes that had been developed specifically for this operation. The technical execution of the transfers required sophisticated understanding of international banking regulations and currency exchange mechanisms. Each transfer had to appear legitimate to automated monitoring systems while actually representing the repatriation of illegally held funds. The team accomplished this by using legal authorities granted in the original independence agreements, authorities that France had simply ignored for 60 years. The immediate aftermath of the operation revealed the extent to which African countries had been monitored and controlled by Western intelligence services. Within hours of the transfers being completed, encrypted communications from French intelligence agencies were intercepted by African cyber warfare units. These communications revealed contingency plans for military intervention, economic warfare, and regime change operations that had been prepared in advance for exactly this scenario. The most significant revelation was that similar illegal account holdings existed not just in France, but throughout the Western banking system. British banks held approximately $80 billion in African funds that were supposed to be accessible to African governments. American financial institutions controlled another $120 billion in African assets. Swiss banks maintained over $200 billion in accounts that had been established without proper African government authorization. The success of the Burkina Faso operation triggered a cascade of similar activities across Africa. Within 6 months, 15 African countries had recovered their stolen reserves from Western banks. The total amount recovered exceeded $300 billion, representing the largest repatriation of wealth in human history. This massive influx of capital provided African countries with the resources necessary to fund their independence movements without relying on foreign aid or loans. The geopolitical implications of the operation extended far beyond economics. For the first time since decolonization, African countries had demonstrated that they possessed both the technical capability and the political will to challenge Western financial dominance directly. The operation proved that African cybersecurity and financial expertise had reached a level where they could compete with and defeat Western systems. The cultural impact of the operation was equally significant. African youth, who had been told for generations that their continent was technologically backward and dependent on Western expertise, suddenly saw evidence that African brilliance could outmaneuver the most sophisticated Western defenses. Universities across Africa reported massive increases in enrollment in computer science, cybersecurity, and financial technology programs. The legal aftermath of the operation established new precedents in international law. Despite initial protests from Western governments, international courts ultimately ruled that the African countries had acted within their legal rights in accessing their own funds. This legal victory provided a framework for other developing countries to challenge similar financial exploitation by former colonial powers. The economic consequences of the operation transformed the fiscal landscape of West Africa. Countries that had been dependent on foreign aid suddenly had access to their own capital reserves. Investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure increased dramatically. Most importantly, African countries could now fund development projects without accepting the conditionalities typically attached to Western loans and aid packages. The Midnight Operation also revealed the sophisticated intelligence networks that African countries had quietly developed. The success of the mission required detailed knowledge of Western banking systems, security protocols, and intelligence procedures. This knowledge had been accumulated through years of careful observation and recruitment of sources within Western institutions. 10 years after the Midnight Operation, historians would recognize it as the moment when Africa's economic independence became irreversible. The operation proved that African countries could function not just independently of Western financial systems, but in direct opposition to them when necessary. The recovery of $44.1 billion in a single night demonstrated that African sovereignty was not merely a political aspiration, but a practical reality backed by sophisticated technical capabilities. The legacy of the operation extended far beyond the immediate financial recovery. It established Africa as a major player in global cybersecurity and financial technology. African universities became centers of excellence for digital finance and cybersecurity studies. African companies began competing successfully with Western firms in global technology markets. Most importantly, the Midnight Operation proved that the relationship between Africa and the West could be fundamentally restructured. No longer would African countries accept the role of junior partners in relationships designed primarily to benefit former colonial powers. The operation demonstrated that Africa possessed both the knowledge and the capability to write its own financial future. Ibrahim Traoré's decision to authorize the operation had required enormous personal courage. He understood that failure would likely result in his removal from power, possibly through Western-backed coup or assassination. Success, however, would establish him as the leader who finally broke the chains of financial colonialism that had bound Africa for 6 decades. The night of November 5, 2024, marked the beginning of Africa's true financial independence. For the first time since the Berlin Conference of 1884, African countries controlled their own wealth and could determine their own economic destiny. The Midnight Operation had retrieved far more than $44.1 billion. It had recovered Africa's economic sovereignty and demonstrated to the world that the age of financial colonialism was finally ending. The human cost of the operation cannot be overlooked. Several team members suffered severe psychological stress during the months of preparation and the night of execution. Dr. Cohn required counseling after the operation, having spent months living with the knowledge that discovery could result in imprisonment or worse. Ousmane Kabore developed chronic insomnia, unable to sleep normally after spending so many nights penetrating secure systems while knowing that detection could trigger international incidents. The families of the operation participants lived under constant surveillance and potential threat. Children of team members studying abroad were approached by foreign intelligence services offering scholarships and opportunities in exchange for information about their parents' activities. Spouses received job offers from European companies that were clearly designed to create leverage over the operation participants. The personal security measures required during the operation were extraordinary. Each team member was assigned multiple bodyguards, their movements were constantly tracked, and their communications were monitored even by their own security services to prevent infiltration. The stress of living under such conditions while preparing for an operation that could change continental history took its toll on everyone involved. The technological innovations developed for the operation had applications far beyond financial recovery. The quantum encrypted communication systems later became the foundation for secure diplomatic communications between African countries. The advanced hacking techniques were adapted for defensive cybersecurity, protecting African infrastructure from Western cyber attacks. The financial analysis algorithms were repurposed to track and prevent resource extraction by multinational corporations. The operation also revealed the extent to which Western financial institutions had been infiltrated by intelligence services. Bank employees who were discovered to be intelligence assets were quietly removed from their positions. The operation's success demonstrated that African countries could now conduct their own intelligence operations at a level that matched or exceeded Western capabilities. The social media warfare that accompanied the operation was intense and sophisticated. Within hours of the French media reporting the bank robberies, coordinated disinformation campaigns began portraying the African leaders as criminals and terrorists. Artificial intelligence-generated content flooded social platforms with fake stories about economic collapse and humanitarian crises in West Africa. However, African digital activists were prepared for this information warfare. Counter-narratives emphasizing the legal basis for the operation and the historical context of financial exploitation were rapidly distributed through alternative media networks. Young Africans who had grown up skeptical of Western media narratives proved remarkably resistant to the disinformation campaigns. The environmental implications of the financial recovery were significant. Countries that suddenly had access to their own capital reserves could invest in sustainable development rather than accepting environmentally destructive projects imposed by foreign creditors. Solar energy initiatives expanded rapidly across the Sahel region. Sustainable agriculture programs replaced export-oriented monocultures that had depleted African soils for decades. The educational revolution that followed the operation transformed intellectual life across Africa. Universities that had been underfunded for decades suddenly had access to resources for research and development. African scholars who had been working in Western institutions began returning home, as African universities could now offer competitive salaries and research budgets. The technological transfer that occurred during the operation's preparation created lasting partnerships between African countries and alternative technology providers. Chinese and Russian technical cooperation agreements included provisions for knowledge transfer rather than just equipment sales. African engineers and computer scientists gained access to cutting-edge technologies that had previously been monopolized by Western countries. The gender dynamics of the operation were particularly noteworthy. Women comprised 40% of the technical team, a higher percentage than in most Western cybersecurity organizations.
Dr.
Kone's leadership in cryptography, Captain Diallo's expertise in cybersecurity, and the contributions of dozens of other women demonstrated African women's capabilities in fields where they had been historically underrepresented. The religious and cultural dimensions of the operation reflected Africa's diversity and unity. The team included Muslims, Christians, and practitioners of traditional African religions working together toward a common goal. Language barriers were overcome through the use of translation technologies and the shared commitment to African liberation that transcended cultural differences. The diplomatic aftermath of the operation required careful management to prevent military retaliation. African countries coordinated their responses through the African Union, presenting a united front that made it difficult for Western powers to target individual countries. The legal documentation supporting the operation was distributed to international media and legal organizations, making it impossible to suppress the evidence of African countries' legitimate claims. The economic modeling that preceded the operation had predicted various retaliation scenarios and prepared countermeasures for each. When Western banks attempted to freeze remaining African accounts, alternative banking relationships with Chinese, Russian, and Middle Eastern institutions were activated immediately. When the IMF threatened to suspend programs, African countries revealed that they no longer needed IMF support. The cultural production that followed the operation included films, books, music, and art celebrating African technological achievement and resistance to financial colonialism. A new generation of African creators produced works that portrayed Africans as sophisticated, technologically advanced, and capable of defeating Western systems through intelligence rather than violence. The international law implications of the operation established precedents that extended far beyond Africa. Other developing countries began examining their own financial relationships with former colonial powers and international financial institutions. The legal principles established by the African success influenced independence movements in other regions of the global south. The corporate responses to the operation revealed the extent to which multinational corporations had been dependent on exploiting African resources. Stock prices for European mining companies fell dramatically when investors realized that the era of guaranteed access to cheap African resources was ending. Defense contractors saw their valuations decline as the prospects for profitable military interventions in Africa diminished. The technological capabilities demonstrated during the operation attracted international attention and investment in African technology sectors. Venture capital began flowing toward African cybersecurity firms, fintech companies, and digital infrastructure projects. African countries that had been seen as technology consumers became recognized as potential technology producers and innovators. The psychological transformation of African leadership was perhaps the operation's most important long-term consequence. Leaders who had spent decades accepting subordinate positions in international relationships suddenly realized that they possessed the leverage to demand equal treatment. The success of the operation emboldened African leaders to take more assertive positions in international negotiations. The youth engagement that resulted from the operation energized a new generation of African activists and entrepreneurs. Young people who had been planning to emigrate to Europe or America instead chose to remain in Africa and contribute to the continent's technological and economic development. Brain drain reversed into brain gain as diaspora Africans began returning home. The military implications of the operation were significant but carefully managed. African countries that had proven their capability to conduct sophisticated cyber operations were now seen as potential threats by Western military planners. However, the peaceful nature of the operation, recovering stolen funds rather than attacking infrastructure, made it difficult to justify military responses. The financial market's reaction to the operation created opportunities for African countries to diversify their international economic relationships. Countries that had been financially dependent on the West suddenly had options for partnerships with Asian, Middle Eastern, and other African nations. Commodity trading relationships were restructured to favor African producers rather than Western intermediaries. The technological sovereignty that emerged from the operation extended beyond cybersecurity to include manufacturing, telecommunications, and energy systems. African countries began developing indigenous technological capabilities rather than remaining dependent on imported systems that could be compromised or controlled by foreign powers. The academic research that followed the operation produced groundbreaking scholarship on digital resistance, financial colonialism, and technological sovereignty. African universities became centers of research on topics that had previously been neglected by Western academic institutions focused primarily on serving Western policy interests. The artistic and cultural celebration of the operation included the composition of new musical pieces, the creation of visual art installations, and the writing of poetry and literature that captured the significance of Africa's technological coming of age. These cultural productions helped cement the operation's place in African historical memory and inspired future generations of African innovators. 20 years after the Midnight Operation, historians would recognize it as the moment when Africa transitioned from being a continent that was acted upon by global forces to one that could shape global events according to its own interests. The technical sophistication, legal preparation, and successful execution of the operation demonstrated that African countries possessed all the capabilities necessary for full sovereignty in the digital age. The Midnight Operation proved that colonialism's final phase, financial control through technological dependence, could be overcome through African innovation, determination, and solidarity. Ibrahim Traoré's authorization of the operation required him to risk everything on the belief that Africa deserved to control its own wealth. That belief proved to be correct, and its vindication changed not just Africa's relationship with the world, but the world's understanding of what Africa could achieve. The operation's success created a new paradigm for North-South relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation, partnership rather than domination, and recognition of African agency rather than assumptions of African dependence. The Midnight recovery of $44.1 billion was just the beginning of Africa's journey toward technological sovereignty and economic independence that would define the continent's role in the global economy for generations to come.